I'm the president of the Institute for Indo-Pacific Security. That's double IPS for you and me. And we're excited to have you here with us, both in person and online. And I'm looking forward to a really fascinating discussion on the international security landscape for Taiwan. I'm super excited to kick things off this morning with Ian Easton, not only an associate professor at the Naval War College, but importantly, an alum of double IPS' predecessor organization, the Project 2049 Institute. Ian's going to give us an overview of the threat that China poses to the Taiwan Strait and the state of play on the western side of the strait, especially in the lead up to the Trump-Xi summit. After that, I'll turn it over to double IPS Senior Director Mike Mazza to moderate a panel discussing U.S.-Taiwan security cooperation, and we'll close the event with a discussion of allied cooperation in support of Taiwanese defense, moderated by double IPS Senior Director Jennifer Hong. Once again, I'd like to thank you all for being here, and I'm looking forward to a fascinating discussion with our guests. And with that, it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Ian Easton from the Naval War College, author of The Taiwan Invasion Threat and the Final Struggle, distinguished alum of Project 2049, and senior fellow with the Institute of Indo-Pacific Security. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ian Easton. Ian, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, a very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and hello from Newport, Rhode Island. I'm absolutely thrilled to join you here today for this important discussion at double IPS. It's a tremendous privilege to be here with you. And for me, I have to say it brings back many happy memories. For those of you who are lucky enough to be sitting there in Suite 250, you're right there on 2300 Clarendon Boulevard. 16 years ago, when I first arrived in Washington, D.C., that was not yet the beautiful conference center that it is today. Back then, it was office spaces, and importantly, it was the global headquarters of the small but mighty Project 2049 Institute. Ladies and gentlemen, I spent hundreds, probably thousands of hours at blissful research and conversation with colleagues right where you're sitting today. And looking back on it from this vantage point, and especially in view of recent events, in many ways, the world at that time was much simpler. And certainly Taiwan was much safer than it is today. Of course, at that time, Xi Jinping had not yet become the paramount leader of the regime in Beijing. He had not yet tattooed his name onto the Chinese Communist Party constitution. And by any measure, China, the People's Republic of China, was at that time much weaker and far less aggressive than it is today. What has happened over these 16 years is both, I think, extraordinary, but also disquieting. And so I'd like to share a few thoughts on what's happened and what might happen in the future, where things might be going. But before I do that, I owe you all the standard disclaimer that I have officially taken leave from my office to join you for this event here this afternoon. And so nothing that I say is in any way representative of the official views or opinions of the U.S. Naval War College, the U.S. Navy, or the U.S. government. I'm purely here in my personal capacity to share a few thoughts, and that's really it. I wanted to kick off our conversation with a short story. When I was in high school, there was this super cool sci-fi kung fu action movie that came out called The Matrix. It was filmed in Sydney, Australia, and at the time, this is 1999, the special effects in that movie were absolutely cutting edge. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. It was mind-blowing. And I went back to the theaters to see it again and again. Well, I hadn't thought very much about that movie in a number of years, but I recently was on a work trip in Australia with some colleagues from the War College. And being there on the streets where they filmed The Matrix brought back some memories of it. And it reminded me of this scene in the movie that we used to talk about all the time at Project 2049. It's this classic scene where the hero, a guy named Neo, meets his soon-to-be severely cool partner in crime, Trinity. They're at an underground rave, and Rob Zombie is blaring through the speakers, and she walks across the room, and she says to him, I know who you are, Neo, and I know why you're here. I know why you work late at night, night after night on your computer, why you don't sleep. You're looking for an answer. It's the question that drives us. Now, for anyone who's done serious research and writing, we all know what that feels like, to be driven by this desire, this hunger for new knowledge. What it feels like to kind of be almost burning with curiosity, that you don't want to go home at night. You just want to keep reading. You want to keep learning. You want to keep pushing the horizons of what you know. Well, in the movie, the question that Neo was after was the question of what is the Matrix? There's a different question, ladies and gentlemen, I think at some level has been on all of our minds. It's certainly a question that has been on the minds of many people in many different places. It's a question whose answer will have profound implications for the national security of the United States and of Taiwan. And not only for our two countries, but also for countries around the world. We've all seen the news, of course, that Xi Jinping has told his army, his military, the People's Liberation Army, to be prepared to successfully invade and occupy Taiwan by the end of 2027 in case he decides to order that operation. So the question then is, what is he really thinking? What really are his plans and intentions? What is his decision-making process as it relates to Taiwan? And to what extent, I think we might ask, is that a noble question? You know, there's a common school of thought in the analytic community that our adversaries' plans and intentions are always somewhat unknowable. And at a minimum, they're very ambiguous. They're very elastic. They're very changeable, right? A foreign leader's decision-making can change really on a dime, can change in a heartbeat. But to what extent, we might ask, is that actually true in this case? Is this a researchable question? And can we boldly hazard an estimate regarding how Xi thinks? Can we consider whether he has made or will make a firm political decision to use force against Taiwan once all other means of obtaining his objective have failed? Well, I would suggest that we should do just that. Now, to begin, we might ask, to what extent is he a rational actor? And would a blockade or an invasion of Taiwan make sense to him based on his own personal calculations of cost versus benefits? And if so, under what circumstances might a decision to strike happen? How are we to understand the role of chance, the role of luck? How are we to understand, we might ask, the odds of him acting irrationally or making a gross strategic miscalculation that appears irrational to us, but it's actually a decision that he's made on the basis of his best available information. Now, once we have an estimate to work with, of course, we can debate it. We can revisit it over time, and we can sharpen it as events unfold. That would all be impossible, of course, without a plain statement of our best analytic opinion of where things now stand. And so I'll give you mine. The Chinese Communist Party runs the People's Republic of China, and Xi Jinping makes the decisions. We should anchor any strategic analysis around him because he maintains a monopoly on power and he exerts effective command and control over China's military forces. The People's Liberation Army does not act on its own initiative. It undertakes virtually nothing that he has not ordered or explicitly approved. There are no independent power centers in Xi Jinping's China. As a result, we can deduce what decisions he has made based on the observable actions that are taking place under his rule. Now, at the outset, it might be helpful for us to remember or to remind ourselves that the application of force is an essential pillar of the Communist Party's control over China. The regime has remained in power only because of the PLA and to a lesser extent, its other armed wings. China is threatening Taiwan not because Xi Jinping seeks a quote unquote military solution, but because the PLA may be the only realistic means of obtaining the desired political objective. Xi Jinping, I think, made the basic political decision to gain effective control over Taiwan and to occupy it as part of the PRC. And he seems to have made that decision long ago, at least 10 years ago, probably far longer than that. As a result, a sweeping military reform and reorganization program began, somewhat tentatively, in the summer of 2015. And it picked up enormous speed in early 2016 when Xi Jinping launched an enormous, a mega project to create a joint force capable of fighting and winning in the most difficult circumstances that Xi or his generals or admirals could possibly envision. And he was explicit about that he wanted to create this kind of military. That event in 2016 marked a historic turning point. The PLA that we are dealing with today, the threat that we now see, can be traced back to decisions that Xi made long ago. Now, how much, we might ask, has really changed over the last 10 years? Well, consider, if you will, that the PLA in 2016 had only 2 Marine brigades. Today, they have 11 Marine brigades and counting. Consider also that the PLA now has the world's largest fleets of hovercrafts, amphibious assault vehicles, and its largest fleet of swimming tanks to deliver those Marines along with their Army amphibious counterparts who are actually even more capable than those Marines. And along with that, the PLA now fields both mobile pier systems and amazingly innovative bridge barge systems, or shuiqiao, to support amphibious landing operations. In tandem with that, the PLA has improved its airborne, its air assault, and its special operations forces. And PLA generals writing in their internal military journals have explicitly linked this buildup to future urban warfare operations on Taiwan. Consider, too, that back in 2019, it was a very big deal when the PLA carried out some 2,000 air sorties in the Taiwan Strait area. At the time, that number was remarkable. It seemed quite concerning, if not ominous. Well, last year, in 2025, the PLA surpassed 5,700 air sorties. Think back, if you will, to 2019. I believe it was November of that year when 2 PLA warplanes first crossed the Taiwan Strait median line. When they did that, they broke a long-held and long-respected tacit agreement not to do something destabilizing like that. Again, at that time, it was a big deal. Well, since then, the PLA has been breaking the cross-strait median line so frequently that we're now numb to it. It's now a routine occurrence. It's almost a daily occurrence. So too are PLA balloon flights and drone flights around and over Taiwan. What has also happened since then are a number of other remarkable military and security developments in China. For example, in 2020, during the darkest days of the COVID-19 pandemic, when you would have thought they would have more important things to do, the PLA announced that it had just ordered 1.5 million sets of body armor, and they linked that purchase to future operations on Taiwan. That they said that's why they were doing it. In 2021, in May of that year, a lone PRC man was arrested trying to sneak into the port of Taichung in central Taiwan in a rubber motorboat. Now, at the time, infiltration like that was unheard of. It was a very, very rare occasion indeed. Now, fast forward 4 years into the future. In May of 2025, last year, 3 PRC individuals were arrested trying to land on Taiwan via small boats. And that was just in 1 month alone. There has been a remarkable uptick in these kinds of cases. There's also been a spike in spy cases, espionage, in cyber attacks, in sabotage, including against Taiwan's undersea cables. And the PLA has been conducting alarmingly complex, large-scale, and realistic snap exercises around and across from Taiwan, simulating future blockade and invasion scenarios. They've also been conducting live fire drills off Taiwan's coast without prior notification, even though that's against international law, and of course it's against international custom and good judgment as well. It's a very hostile act. And some of these operations are now occurring, and I think they're increasingly occurring in high-risk weather conditions. Not the kind of thing that you would expect to see if this was purely a coercion. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, China is changing the status quo, and it's making the region less stable and more dangerous. Now, it's theoretically possible that Xi Jinping has directed all of these actions and initiated all of these military preparations for coercion purposes alone. He may have little or no intention of ever pulling the trigger. But I personally think that he made the decision to annex Taiwan long ago, and he firmly intends to obtain that objective, even if it requires the employment of force when other measures have been unsuccessfully tried. I think that's what the evidence that we have available to us suggests, and I think it suggests it very strongly. Now, in the interim, Xi Jinping has made a series of decisions to employ non-lethal means against Taiwan, testing to see what helps make progress toward obtaining his goal. These means involve political, economic, and military pressure tactics. If Xi has sometimes seemed indecisive to us or cautious due to the considerable number and variety of measures tried, the reality is that he has almost certainly had his end goal fixed in his mind all along, and he intends to have it. Indeed, the more options that Xi Jinping devises and tries to secure the takeover of Taiwan, the more serious we know he is about that objective and obtaining it. And the more likely it becomes over time that he will use force and exercise the military option when all else fails, or at least when he believes all else has failed. By now, I would argue that there should be little doubt that annexing Taiwan is of overriding importance to him, and it should be evident from his actions that he is making decisions geared toward the attainment of that objective. All major political and military actions in China that are unusual or non-routine emanate from decisions that are made by Xi Jinping. The kinds of things that we are reading about and seeing the PLA do don't just happen. This PRC is a centrally controlled state. It is a one-party dictatorship that has pervasive surveillance. It has multiple and competing domestic intelligence and secret police organizations. It has highly sophisticated means of monitoring people, and especially CCP members and military personnel. Extraordinary actions, therefore, require national authority, and that means Xi Jinping. As a result, when things out of the ordinary happen, we can then infer his plans, his mindset, and his reasoning. Observable actions offer us a window into his decision-making. Now, as we ponder what Xi Jinping might be thinking and what he might do next, two things deserve our attention. The first is that an invasion of Taiwan is not irrational if it is likely to succeed. The PRC's plans to invade Taiwan have been carefully deliberated for decades, and they have been meticulously prepared in a cold manner by highly intelligent men and women who are capable of extraordinary strategic discipline. The use of force is a logical course politically, economically, legally, and militarily from the Chinese Communist Party's perspective. While there are enormous risks associated with an operation like that, they seem to be shrinking over time, and they are certainly less grave from the CCP standpoint than allowing Taiwan indefinitely to remain an independent liberal democracy. CCP elites like Xi Jinping fear for their hold on power, and they feel humiliated by Taiwan's quote-unquote separatist or independent status quo. We should not reject the idea of invasion as irrational or illogical just because we are opposed personally to revanchism and horrified by its consequences. We may simply be failing to appreciate how strongly Xi Jinping and his colleagues feel about this. They seem to believe, and they say they believe, that Taiwan is the key to unlocking China's destiny. Xi Jinping has publicly declared that the unification of Taiwan is, quote, in the fundamental interest of China. It is obviously necessary for achieving the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, end quote. She sees the subjugation of this island nation as a, quote, sacred mission and a, quote, unfulfilled historic mission. And that's what PLA officers are told. I think Xi Jinping will feel insecure and vulnerable until the job is done. And he might believe that an amphibious assault is likely to succeed. And if he doesn't believe that today, we have to be very careful to maintain deterrence, because he might come to that decision, he might come to that viewpoint and that belief in the future. The issue then is one of expected calculations of cost and pain, to be sure, but also tremendous benefit and gain for him and his legacy. The second and final point that I'd like to leave you with is that a gross miscalculation is always possible, because no one knows how the war will play out. It doesn't matter how many war games you do. Xi Jinping could miscalculate the strength and the reaction of the Taiwanese or the Americans or both. Politics in Taipei and in Washington is always somewhat uncertain. And he may overestimate China's comparative power. He may also make the decision based on paranoia or hysteria or a sense of desperation that we won't be able to see. We won't be able to detect something like that, because it would happen in an atmosphere of intense stress that only exists between his ears. He certainly appears, at least in some ways, to be suffering from megalomania. And he is clearly constructed and has surrounded himself with a cult of personality. So in conclusion, it seems evident that Xi Jinping is committed to obtaining Taiwan, and he's obsessed with this problem. We would be wise to acknowledge the rising possibility that he will use force to reach his goals. And he may do so in a manner that surprises us. But there is, of course, good news, ladies and gentlemen. The good news is that the United States and Taiwan, together with our like-minded allies and partners, we all get a vote. And that vote can be made stronger and more powerful if we cast it together. We can work as a team, as a concert of democracies, to prevent aggression and to keep the peace. Now, how best to go about that and where to go from here, I leave to you and to my brilliant friends and colleagues on the following panels. Thank you very much for generously giving me the floor and allowing me this chance to share a few thoughts. I would be delighted to address any questions you may have and to continue the conversation if that's at all useful to you. Thanks again.
Thank you, Ian. That was fantastic. I think we've got time for probably one question. If you would, raise your hand, state your organization, and then if you would, again, wait for the microphone, we'll go from there. So if I could have Ann. So I'm going to go with a double IPS colleague in the back there, Griffin Allen, and we'll see how quickly the response is, and we can determine if we've got one more.
Okay. Hi, Ian. Great to see you. Great to talk to you. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us. I had a quick question for you. So I've read a little bit of your past research on surprise attacks and strategic surprise from the PLA. I was hoping to ask, especially given what we were talking about today, given the difficulty of achieving full kind of tactical and strategic surprise in modern warfare, where do you think that the PLA needs to be successful in having a surprise attack? Is it in the timing of the invasion? Is it the objectives of the invasion? Is it the methods that they use? Is it something else that we're not thinking about? Yeah, that's my question.
Okay, Griffin, thanks so much for the excellent question. When it comes to surprise, usually surprise doesn't happen so much in the minds of intelligence officers or managers. Usually, and I'm speaking historically here because those are where all of our good examples are. Usually, it happens in the minds of our political leaders, and that's commonly the case. It's also commonly the case, and so I think that's the number one thing that Beijing will target in an operation like that. And it's often the case, and it seems to be certainly currently, that what the PLA will do is to try to instill a sense of complacency in the victim, and or especially if the complacency piece fails them, to get them to sound the alarm at the wrong time, to cry wolf phenomenon. And that's a very difficult problem to deal with. And indeed, that's what happened to U.S. forces before the attack on Pearl Harbor. That's what happened to South Korea in summer of 1950. They had been on alert, for example, 3 times already. And then when the actual North Korean invasion happened, they had grown numb to the problem. That's what happened to Israel in the Yom Kippur War in 1973. They had been on alert 3 times already in the past year. And then when the actual attack happened, they waited until it was too late to mobilize based on political calculations. Frankly, that's also what happened to Ukraine in February of 2022. That's why Ukraine waited until the full Russian invasion had begun before they declared general mobilization. So it's a very difficult problem, and it exists no matter how wise and how courageous the decision makers are. These are always, declaring mobilization, going to full readiness is always a very delicate and nettlesome problem. And of course, we're seeing the PLA and the CCP more broadly do a lot of things today to make it more difficult. So it's certainly something that bears watching, and something that perhaps we should do a lot more work on.
Well, thank you, Ian. That was an excellent answer. I see we've got questions online. I see we've got additional questions in the room. Unfortunately, we've got 2 excellent panels on standby. So if you would, we'll gather those questions. We'll send them to Ian. We'll put him to work, and we'll ask him to respond and get those back to the organization. But with that, I'd like to get one more round of applause for Professor Ian Easton, and welcome the next panel to the chairs. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Ian.
Thank you, John.
Although we don't exactly know when that's going to happen at this point. Obviously, the war in Iran is ongoing, but I think that obscures what's really been a pretty busy few months in U.S.-Taiwan relations. Between the announcement of arms sales, the conclusion of economic agreement, congressional action, there's a lot going on, which I think is flying under the radar for those of us who don't watch this closely. So we wanted to take this opportunity today to bring together a really stellar panel to talk about those issues. I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers here. I'm going to start off the conversation with a few questions to each of them, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So very briefly, I'm going to do this briefly because I do want to get to the conversation here. On my far left is Rupert Hammond-Chambers. Rupert is the president of the U.S.-Taiwan Business Council, known to some of us as the Black Hand of Taiwan arms sales. He's also a senior advisor at Bauer Group Asia, and he is on the board of IIPS. To my immediate left is Patrick Nevins. Patrick is the Deputy Staff Director for the House Armed Services Committee. He previously served in the Department of Defense and is a Marine Corps veteran. And then joining us remotely, although she's not on screen just yet, is Dr. Kristy Xu. Dr. Xu is the director of the Taiwan ASEAN Study Center at the Chung-Hua Institution for Economic Research, which is probably the leading Taiwanese economic think tank. She serves as a non-resident senior research fellow at the Taiwan Asia Exchange Foundation and is a senior fellow at the Center for Asia-Pacific Resilience and Innovation. She has also spent time in the United States studying the semiconductor supply chains and the issues that are arising due to that or associated with that in U.S.-Taiwan relations. So before we get started, one moment of direction, if you wouldn't mind. If you are joining us remotely, if you are online and have questions, please don't use the hand raise function. We're going to take those questions via text. So go ahead and type them into the chat. Be sure you give us your name and affiliation if you want your question to be asked of the panelists. And if you are asking that question for a particular panelist, please specify that as well. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to start with a question for Rupert. You know, I would argue that in the Trump administration thus far, there has been some mixed signals when it comes to Taiwan policy. We've had 2 arms sales, which have been announced, a third which has now been delayed. The national security strategy explicitly named Taiwan as a priority for U.S.-Taiwan relations. That was left out of the national defense strategy. How do you understand these mixed signals, and how would you characterize U.S.-Taiwan relations right now?
Thank you, Mike. Oh, sorry. Things that we can use are we can hang our hat on to state that the relationship is healthy, moving in a good direction, that communication is in a good place, and we can point to things that raise concerns. If we were to break that down in respect to Mr. Trump's second term, as you astutely note, we've had arms sales. The one at the tail end of last year was the largest so-called package that we've had since the switch in recognition in '79, with more to come. We've had a tariff agreement, art agreement, that still requires legislative passage in Taiwan, but nevertheless is as comprehensive an agreement as we've seen since Taiwan has ceded to the WTO and concluded its negotiation with the United States in February of '98. So those are incredibly encouraging. However, where are the high-level visits from political appointees to Taiwan? Why are we not sending assistant secretaries and deputy assistant secretaries at a good clip, particularly from economic portfolios? Why have cabinet officers stopped traveling to the United States? Communication should be the bedrock of strong U.S.-Taiwan relations, but for all intents and purposes, that aspect of U.S.-Taiwan relations is all but stopped. And I think there's a pretty good case to be made that Mr. Trump and his colleagues have gone out to all departments and said, listen, particularly in the run-up to my meeting with Xi Jinping at some point this spring, if he in fact makes it to China, I don't want any Taiwan-related comments. I want everybody to play, to play it very low key. Bridge Colby, the Undersecretary for Policy at in the Department of War, was asked a question just several weeks ago about Taiwan, and he responded with a comment on the first island chain. I think I would just cite that as an illustration of the point I'm making, is that the degree to which they're willing to take on risk as they see it is very low. And I'm just one final thought on that. It is a false choice. What Mr. Trump's administration demonstrated in the first term, persons like this institution's chairman, Randy Schreiber, is that you can have a strong relationship with Taiwan. You can sell weapons, you can send high-level government officials, and you can still conduct a relationship with China. It is a false choice to think you have to choose between one and the other.
Thank you, Rupert. Let me just pick up on this theme with Dr. Xu. Dr. Xu, can you hear me? Dr. Xu?
Yes. Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. So Rupert mentioned the agreement on tariffs that was announced a month or so ago, but not long after, the Trump administration announced a Section 301 investigation into whether Taiwan and a number of other countries are engaged in unfair trade practices. Could you talk about how you understand these, again, these sort of mixed signals about the status of the U.S.-Taiwan trade and economic relationship, and where you think things are headed at this moment?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the question and having me here. Rupert has mentioned about these two agreements. One is on trade, the other is on investment MOU. Both are very significant, but they are now pending legislative approval, especially for the trade agreement, because that trade agreement will reduce Taiwan's reciprocal tariff from 20% plus the most favored nation rate to a maximum of 15%, bringing Taiwan in line with Japan and South Korea. However, that is not the case now. And you mentioned about this investigation. So 2 weeks ago, Trump administration launched two investigations, one on excess capacity, the other one on importation of goods allegedly using forced labor. So Taiwan, together with other countries, including Japan, China, South Korea, and 6 or 7 Southeast Asian countries where Taiwan has heavily manufacturing investment, are all targeted because of this. However, though this investigation still takes time, but for Taiwan's case, this will not, we believe, will not impact Taiwan hugely, because I'm going to explain this. Because Taiwan right now is relatively better positioned due to its strategic trade relations with the United States, and also the high degree of trade complementarity between the two economies. And why did I say that? Last year, the United States replaced China and Hong Kong as Taiwan's largest export market, driven primarily by strong demand for AI chips, AI servers, and other ICT products, which accounted together for around 70% of Taiwan's imports in the U.S. And also, the U.S. has also been Taiwan's largest investment destination for 3 consecutive years, supported by, again, the robust AI-related demand here in the U.S., and also Biden and Trump administration's reshoring initiative. So all these trends highlight the core strength of the Taiwan-U.S. bilateral relation lies in its strategic trade structure and deep supply chain integration, particularly in semiconductors and advanced technology. So this is even more re-enhanced because of this very strategic investment made by TSMC, the expansion in Arizona. So this reflects that Taiwan and U.S. right now are not just trade-centric relations, but also expanding to strategic investment and technology. So having said that, the investigation you just mentioned, we believe it's not going to have huge impact directly on Taiwan, because Taiwan's export structure right now is mostly AI chips, servers, and all these things that are highly demanded here in the U.S. And as the previous case, all these are exempted by either 232 investigation or by reciprocal trade tariff. Therefore, in the future, we believe there will be a potential for these major export items to be exempted. However, this investigation targeting other countries, including Vietnam and also some Southeast Asian countries, will have a huge impact on Taiwan, because exports from these countries to the U.S. will very likely to be targeted under this investigation. So I think it's the impact on Taiwan will be very much mixed.
Thank you, Dr. Xu. And if I could just follow up, you mentioned the importance of semiconductors in U.S.-Taiwan trade. You mentioned the TSMC investments here in the United States. Do you think that the United States and Taiwan can find a happy medium here? Right, their interests are not exactly aligned. The United States wants as much semiconductor production in the United States as possible. Taiwan wants to keep as much as it can at home, understandably. Is this going to remain an irritant or can both countries find a way to cooperate here that is mutually beneficial and in which both countries' interests are protected and served?
Yeah. Yeah, I was often asked this question that why Taiwan or TSMC is holding its most advanced chip operations in Taiwan without having more advanced chips to be outsourced or to be established in US. And that is not the case now because TSMC first announced its investment plan in the United States in 2020. And it was exactly during Trump's first term. That is why that President Trump and his cabinet have paid particular attention to this company. Since 2020, the company, the world's largest and most advanced semiconductor manufacturer, has significantly expanded its U.S. investment. From an initial plan to build a facility utilizing TSMC's 5-nanometer technology for semiconductor wafer fabrication to expand to a committed silicon cluster of a total of 6 fabrication facilities, 2 advanced test and packaging plants, and an R&D center. So the total investment reached approximately $165 billion now, while the first commitment they made was only about $12 billion. And 2 years ago, end of 2024, TSMC already began producing 4-nanometer. It's not 5-nanometer as they have originally planned. It's 4-nanometer produced in the United States. And though the project has faced numerous challenges, it has continued to make steady progress. The company right now is expecting to begin 2-nanometer instead of 3-nanometer as originally planned to be produced in Arizona by 2028 at its second fab, and also potentially more advanced nodes to follow at its third facility. That means TSMC right now is establishing its most advanced fabrication capabilities in the US, including 4-nanometer, 2-nanometer, and potentially even more advanced A16 technology in the future. And this represents cutting-edge nodes that are going to be in the United States to satisfy this particular demand driven by the AI boom. So in terms of technology and in terms of capacity, I think what TSMC has committed back in 2020 right now is totally a different story. And now it's most advanced chip and also as large production as they believe commercially viable for this market.
Thank you, Dr. Hsu. Let's turn to defense for a moment. If I could turn to you, Patrick. So yes, we've got this debate going on in the LOI over defense spending in Taiwan, but Congress has been busy here on Taiwan issues. Last year's NDAA had quite a number of provisions which were relevant to Taiwan in one way or another. Could you talk through maybe some of the more important substantive ones?
Yeah, of course, happy to. And in addition to the NDA last year, we also had the opportunity to pass a reconciliation law as the authorizer is a unique opportunity to be appropriators for the day, which they reveled in. And so within that $150 billion, there's a good amount of money for critical munitions, expanding the industrial base to increase capability and capacity for munitions. And so I think that is, maybe not top of mind, but still very relevant and important for Taiwan. With regards to NDAA, I think first and foremost, $1 billion for the Taiwan Security Cooperation Initiative. That's a large investment that is directly for Taiwan, whether it's for increasing partnership opportunities or munitions and key critical capabilities. That is something that has had overwhelming support for, and I think is incredibly important to continue. There's some other pieces like Section 1266, which is a joint program with Taiwan to enable fielding of uncrewed systems and counter uncrewed system capabilities. I think that is, similar to some of the things that that we've been doing with Israel on co-production and co-development of critical capabilities. So I think things like that will reap dividends for the partnership and for the self-defense of Taiwan. There's a whole host of reporting requirements of ensuring that the Congress is getting information and that the Department of Defense, Department of War are enacting the things that have congressional intent and support in the defense of Taiwan. And then, I would also want to mention some of the kind of secondary benefits that may not be, direct support to Taiwan, but do have positive ramifications. Things like multi-year procurement for critical munitions, particularly air defense munitions. That'll help increase the industrial base back here, which will then hopefully mean increased flows to Taiwan for munitions that have been on order for a long time. And then additionally, extending the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. So that gets after the entire region, while TSCI gets after just Taiwan initiatives. PDI is about the larger region and increasing the capability and capacity for allies and partners throughout the Indo-Pacific region. So I think that's a handful of things that were enacted last year, would be the legislation that have positive impacts for Taiwan.
Thank you. And what do you see as the priorities for the year ahead?
As you've kind of probably heard through my comments already, but increasing the industrial base. Chairman Rogers has made that very clear that last year was acquisition reform was the priority for the NDA. This year, he is focusing on the industrial base. So I think being able to make it easier to do business with the department and creating a more steady demand signal for critical munitions, for ships, for all sorts of things, will not only reap benefits for the U.S., but also for allies and partners. So I think that's the key one for us. And I think that also plays into hopefully increased flows of munitions and other defense items that have been on order for a long time. One example of the Harpoon missiles. The systems have been in Taiwan for many years, and they're ready. But the actual missiles have been delayed year over year. So I think there will be positive effects of increasing the industrial base for the ability to deliver on those key munitions. Extending TSCI and PDI will be priorities for the year as well. There's overwhelming support for that. And so I think continuing to do that, continue to expand it, and we'll see what the budget request comes over from the administration, whether or not it's at $1 billion or a different number. But I think you'll see Congress seeking some robust funding for TSCI. And any other ways that we can increase partnership with Taiwan Defense, whether bring them into RIMPAC and other ongoing exercises throughout the region, whatever Congress can do to help support that. And then some other tangential things that I think are of interest is number one is just the overall readiness of U.S. forces within the region. I think there are some secondary effects of the ongoing conflict in Iran, particularly with amphibious, so the ARG-MUs, Marine Expeditionary Units, the 31st MU, which is stationed out of Okinawa and generally spends its time there of Taiwan and north. It has been pulled to go over to CENTCOM. The 11th MU is leaving California now, and it's heading over to CENTCOM as well. And so assets that are typically within the region to help provide deterrence, to do training, those types of things, have been pulled. And I think there could potentially be some long-term readiness impacts of those forces being ready should a Taiwan situation occur. And then on that note a little bit is the ongoing talks for the Defense Policy Review Initiative with the government of Japan. And the Marines have been very vocal of their desire not to move off of Okinawa, but the timelines associated with DPRI that have been agreed to will move those forces, and they've started to flow out of Okinawa into Guam. So I think keeping an eye on that will also be of interest.
Rupert, maybe I'll go back to you for one more question before we open it up to the audience. So that was a pretty extensive sort sort of list of things that Congress is trying to do to improve our ability to defend forward in the Pacific, to improve Taiwan's ability to defend itself. But at the same time, we have this pretty significant domestic political debate going on in Taiwan over the special defense budget. We have now had members of Congress here openly weigh in on that debate with some pretty strongly worded comments about the opposition in particular. How important is it that the Lai administration special defense budget or something like it gets passed, not just for Taiwan's defense, but for the political commitment of Americans to ensure a strong defense in the Taiwan Strait?
It's very important, absolutely. For Taiwan to move to 5% is a military and political imperative in its relationship with our country, first and foremost, and the demands that President Trump has made on partners and allies to step up, particularly those that represent critical threat areas for our national interest. And hat tip to President Lai on that front. I would note, it's just my opinion, but you asked, that the congressional letters and the congressional pressure that just came out of the U.S. Congress towards Taiwan, I think, played an important role in focusing the Kuomintang and TPP specifically to stop objecting or stop blocking efforts to, at the very least, discuss what the EY has submitted, has finally been allowed to submit, and as you astutely note, Mike, for discussion this week. And in fact, Minister Gu was talking in the Li Fa UN just today on that very front. Why is it important now? Well, it accelerates Taiwan force modernization, which is imperative, both in respect to FMS commitments and telegraphing to the United States that Taiwan understands the importance of our approach to the so-called asymmetric defense of Taiwan. IPS, the U.S. Taiwan Business Council, and some others argue that the narrowness of U.S. policy and direction on this matter is problematic, and that other domains are being marginalized as a consequence of this focus. But I'm not saying that it's not important. I'm simply saying that there are other domains that are not being focused on as they should be. We should be able to tap our heads and rub our bellies at the same time, not just focus on one domain. But perhaps that will play out or loosen if the EY and the LY are able to move through this process in the springtime and consummate some form of what I would hope will be the EY's submission, not the KMT and TPP submission. Just a couple of other thoughts. Patrick pointed out defense industrial base issues here in the States and the necessity for us to expand our ability to support our own military and our partners and allies. An important part of the EY submission is also domestic spending. Taiwan is attempting to expand its own domestic defense industrial base to create the ability to provide more for its own national defense, in part, it's sometimes on its own, but often in partnership with American companies and the US government. And it needs a significant down payment for that to happen. The KMT and TPP are arguing that it should be pushed into the regular year-on-year budget. If that takes place, that number will be reduced and that process will be slowed down. These are commercial companies and they need a strong demand signal if they're going to invest and to expand an industrial base to provide for the country's national security and defense. So the argument, and I think it's a sound one, is a significant down payment at this juncture, represented by the EY submission, is in the interests of Taiwan's national security and importantly for us here, the interests of U.S. national security. And we have to hope that is where they will end up after the legislature debate.
Thanks, Rupert. All right, let's open it up to questions. I do have more questions, so if you don't speak up, I will continue to ask. Just a reminder for those joining online to please just type your question into the chat box and leave or include your name and affiliation. So did I see Garrett's hand go up first over here? Right in the front, blue shirt.
Hi, my name is Garrett van der Wees. I'm teaching history of Taiwan at George Mason University. Well, thanks very much for this excellent session. I wanted to pick up on something that Rupert said about asymmetric the asymmetric issue. The U.S. has always been pushing Taiwan asymmetric, and in a sense forgetting the other side of the coin there, that Taiwan has to deal with gray zone operations, which themselves are a prelude, preparation for the big day, so to say. So shouldn't the U.S. Basically help Taiwan push back much more on the gray zone operations? And one particular example there is transits through the Taiwan Strait. That used to be one of the things that you would check off, hey, so many transits through the Taiwan Strait. But over the past year, I don't think we have seen that many of them. So could you comment on those 2 points, please? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Garrett. That wasn't a plant, that question, by the way. Of course, you know, I first and foremost, a point. I'm not looking to marginalize the importance of helping Taiwan prepare for a D-Day style scenario. And our friend and colleague previously, Ian Easton, is a significant expert on exactly that. My point is simply that Taiwan, as Garrett just pointed out, has a multi-domain threat. And as Taiwan M&D likes to point out, Minister Gu likes to point out, and some others, it's a balance between D-Day and every day, not all, but and every day. And every day is gray zone. It's quarantine scenarios, it's blockade scenarios. And it's important, Patrick noted harpoon, of course, Taiwan has harpoons, CDCMs, and NASMs and PAC-3s and so on. These are all incredibly important platforms in respect to providing for Taiwan's defense. But how effective are they in dealing with a blockade or a quarantine? Is the United States prepared, if we are talking about resources and time, to make an adjustment to our long-standing policy of ambiguity? Because if we're talking about, if the US is going to remain ambiguous about our commitment to Taiwan and also restrict what we're prepared to sell, we are increasing the likelihood that we're going to open up new vulnerabilities in Taiwan's inability to defend itself. If we're not prepared to sell them helicopters, for example, to move through the waters and detect submarines in the Taiwan Strait, are we prepared to say definitively, we'll take care of that? The U.S. Navy will take care of that. If we're not going to let you take care of it, then we'll do it. A division of responsibility as we move forward to provide more clarity, I'm a strategic clarity guy, just by the way, but more clarity in the relationship, and not to think of it as a blank check that Taiwan would fill out, but more of a dimmer switch, if you think about those in your homes perhaps, or in this building, where you can turn up slowly or down, up and down, and turn the light on more or less in respect to what we're prepared to provide. But I do think we have reached that point, Garrett. And that to me has to be the way forward, because as time progresses, the PLA and the political leadership in China will increasingly recognize that while Taiwan has fortified its defenses in some areas, other areas have been weakened as a consequence of American policy and the absence of resources to meet those challenges. And they will simply adjust, as we know they have. So thank you for that.
Yes, sir. And please, let's follow Garrett's example, and please give us your name and affiliation when you ask a question.
Kevin Mayer with NMB Consulting, formerly with the State Department. It's a question with respect to interpreting the Taiwan Relations Act. A very reasonable, likely scenario would be a quarantine or a blockade of Taiwan. My reading on the language on supplying Taiwan's ability to defend itself, we would be obligated by law, in my interpretation, to resupply Taiwan, which is where you get into a real clash. Is that a reasonable interpretation from the congressional view of the Taiwan Relations Act?
Well, first off, I don't speak for Congress. There's personal viewpoints, and a little bit of a different committee of jurisdiction on that one, more of a foreign affairs. But I think it's a fair question. I don't think, I don't know if the leaders have thought through that, and I don't know, given ongoing conflicts, I'm not sure what role Congress would want to play in support or non-support with regards to a potential conflict or upholding that. Sorry, that's a non-answer.
Thanks. Let's take a question from online. This question comes from Dean Baxendale of Optimum Publishing International. And Dr. Hsu, I'm going to pose this to you first, and then if either of you would like to weigh in, feel free. So the question is this: can Taiwan fend off the Xi initiative, the peaceful reunification of China, which Mr. Baxendale describes as the pitch? Can Taiwan fend that off without the collective support of the United States and NATO allies in three domains: economic, military, and diplomatic? And how should this be communicated to the CCP and the public? So I take that question to mean, can Taiwan hold out on its own if it doesn't have economic, military, and diplomatic support from its overseas partners? Dr. Hsu?
Thank you. I think that question, I can only respond to part of it. In terms of economic resilience, I think this has been an issue for Taiwan, especially after Yang mentioned about this and operations across Taiwan Strait. But especially we found that after Pelosi's visit in Taiwan in August 2022, and there being what we call this Taiwan +1, meaning that American companies and other companies are asking Taiwanese company to set up operations outside Taiwan in case of a blockade or in case Taiwan is quarantined. So that has, on the one hand, put Taiwanese company to be more diversified in terms of supply chain, so that Taiwan and also its overseas supply chain, of course not in China, outside China, will be operating. I mean, in case of anything happen across the Taiwan Strait. On the other hand, that has also put Taiwan, including government and also industry, to reconsider, for example, this access of energy and also other things. And recently, I think it's very important to the US too, that Taiwan, President Lai just announced a few days ago that Taiwan is going to assess starting the operation of the nuclear power plant number 2 and number 3, so that it can better respond to all kinds of cases, and especially to drive Taiwan in this AI-driven era. So I think economically, Taiwan is getting better, more diversified, and also more resilient. But for other things, for example, the military, also other defense, I think we still need to have like-minded countries and also other allies to help Taiwan.
Thank you, Dr. Hsu. Rupert, Patrick, would either of you like to weigh in on this? Taiwan's ability to resist peaceful unification without overseas support?
I think it's largely dependent upon the timeline that we're talking about. I think in the next few years it would probably be difficult, but the longer some of these continued training exercises can go on, the longer that Taiwan can work on its own domestic industrial base, the longer that U.S. industrial base has to spin up and get the munitions and arms that Taiwan needs, then it's more in their favor. So I think it's a question of what type of time frame we're looking at. Is this 1 to 2 years, or is it 5 to 7? And the longer we go, the more prepared.
Just to look at it through the prism of Taiwan's domestic politics, it's hard to imagine that if the United States formally withdrew its support, whatever that looked like, that would not have a significant impact on the way in which Taiwan's domestic political constituencies saw their future. And certainly for those independents or those who sit in the middle, who sway elections one way or the other, that they would not then look more favorably towards the Kuomintang position that some sort of engagement with the Chinese was essential for the long-term interests of Taiwan. It would have a significant impact on Taiwan's domestic politics, for sure.
Thank you both. Let's go. Yes, sir. Just wait for the mic, please. Thank you.
Yes, my name is Prab. I'm from Quran Equities. So my question is about the midterm election, 2026. Nancy Pelosi is retiring, as you know. Ed Markey, well, he has a tough race with Seth Moulton in Massachusetts Senate. So these two names I mentioned are the benchmark for U.S.-Taiwan relations. And even, as you know, Pelosi went to Taiwan during COVID crisis as well. So considering these two candidates may not be there after 2026, touch wood, who will lead the benchmark from U.S. Congress if these two guys are not there anymore?
I think there's a handful of folks who are staunch Taiwanese supporters. I think any of the folks who have been vocal of Russia's actions in Ukraine, there's a large Venn diagram there of folks who are equally supportive of Taiwan's desires to be independent or whatever, in control of their future. And so, yes, I think those two people have carried the water over the last years, but I think you have a broad bipartisan support for Taiwan, and I think you've seen that through voting on the NDAA. There's always amendments to strip out funding for Taiwan or to strip out TSCI, those types of things, and the vote counts on those are overwhelmingly supportive of what is happening in Taiwan. So yes, there may be a little bit of a void for those two people that you mentioned. I still think that there is a large amount of support.
Just to bring a little history to it, when I came out of uni and started doing Taiwan work in the mid to late 90s, the voices like Senator Rockefeller, Senator Murkowski, the present senator's father, Senator Helms, we had a very strong bipartisan support for Taiwan. Admittedly, we go through Bush and Obama years, which are China accommodationist, but even then, from congressional standpoint, we had strong bipartisan support through that period. My point simply is that as we go through these different periods and look back, there are transitions from one constituency, if you will, bipartisan, into a new one. And it certainly fills me with faith that, obviously Mrs. Pelosi has enormous shoes to be filled in the context of her commitment to Taiwan and what she was prepared to do. But I feel confident that Republicans and Democrats will produce new persons in the future who will fill those shoes.
Other questions? All right, maybe I'll ask a question of Dr. Xu. So we mentioned earlier in the discussion this upcoming Trump-Xi Jinping summit. From an economic perspective, are there potential outcomes of that summit that are concerning or worrying for Taiwan? What are the outcomes that you're looking to see on the economic front? What are you hoping to avoid?
I think President Trump just announced that meeting is going to be delayed for about a month, right? Because right now the U.S. is busy in Middle East. However, I think Trump and Xi meeting or summit will signal improved relation between the world's largest and second largest economies, economically speaking. Suggesting reduced tension or conflict or great potential for cooperation. So such development, we believe, for Taiwan and also for business sectors will help stabilize world economy and also benefit many of their trading partners. So I think in Taiwan that people are they are cautious, optimistic about the coming, though. People here do understand there may not be huge or significant policy shifts. And also for the case of Taiwan, we all know that we have very close ties with China earlier, but right now, over the years, since mid-2010s, Taiwan has diversified its economic relations with other countries, including US and Japan. So I think for Taiwan, though we look forward to a more improved relation between the U.S. and China, but we are also prepared to see more difficult also challenge between these two big powers.
Thank you, Dr. Xu. Rupert, do you want to weigh in on this question?
I'm okay.
Okay. All right. We do have another question from online. This comes from a journalist, Mark, from the United Daily News based in Taiwan. And Mark's question is this: if the KMT takes office in 2028, do you think Taiwan's defense policy would change? How confident are we that Taiwan's deterrence policy would continue under a KMT administration? Rupert, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I'm confident it would. You know, I think for a couple of reasons. One, there is some precedent for I mean, even today, it's clear that the KMT does respond to pressure from the United States in respect to defense. The KMT obviously takes a somewhat different approach in respect to how it views China and the necessity for communication with China around the so-called 92 consensus, and what that might, certainly in the short term, reap in respect to a reduction of tensions. But I would make a broader point about the KMT should they win the 2028 election, is that if they don't have the backing of the United States, and that starts today, frankly, Mr. Trump will still be president after the Taiwan presidential election and inauguration. If they lose Trump, if you will, as a consequence of behavior between now and then, it will significantly undermine the KMT's ability to engage the Chinese. Why would the Chinese listen to the KMT if it was clear that the United States had lost confidence in the party? It would undermine the KMT's ability to negotiate and engage with China from a position of strength. It's essential that relationship remain healthy. And I think partly that's the reason why the KMT is moving out now and has been responsive to congressional pressure, as well as increased pressure from our executive branch over what's taking place. So I would expect them to continue to support defense and continue to spend money on defense. I would simply point out that it is likely that the trajectory for growth that the Lai administration has framed, moving to 5% and beyond, that will be curbed down. Maybe as soon as this spring, that will be brought down, and they'll have to take responsibility for that and have to argue why they think it's important not to increase spending, but to spend less than is being demanded by the United States and presented to them by the opposition that's in the presidency at the moment.
Thanks. Other questions? We've got time for one or two more. Yes, in the back. Oh, right in front of you.
Hi, my name is Kara. I am from the Global Taiwan Institute, and I have my question directed to Rupert. Rupert, I was going to ask you this afterwards, so I hope you don't mind me voicing it in front of the entire crowd, but you mentioned strategic clarity earlier on. I assume this is your personal view as opposed to the US-Taiwan Business Council. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about why you think this could be beneficial right now in the US-Taiwan relationship.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. It is my personal position, but it is also the position of the US-Taiwan Business Council. So we have written letters to successive administrations about the point that I made from Garrett's excellent question. Our view very much is that clarity, when directed at the Chinese, is actually a healthy thing, and that while ambiguity served an important role in the past, I'm not dismissing that, absolutely it did, but ambiguity hangs its hat on the notion that Taiwan is going to declare so-called de jure independence, right? The Republic of Taiwan. I just don't see it. I don't think that's a realistic or reasonable argument anymore. After Tsai Ing-wen moved the debate around so-called independence within the DPP and embraced the KMT position, which is that the Republic of China has sovereignty and is a sovereign country in of itself. There is no need to declare the Republic of Taiwan because Taiwan is already a sovereign country. And it lanced that issue within the DPP and marginalized the ability of the Deep Greens, the pro-independence wing, so to speak, to undermine that issue. When we look at it from an American standpoint, it has opened up the possibility for us to inject more transparency and clarity into our intention at a time when Chinese antagonism and belligerence towards the island has ticked up more and more and more. How should we respond to that? Well, one of the thoughts, if Randy were here, perhaps he would say the same thing Mike can pipe into. He's an expert in of himself. But, you know, for me, I would argue there should be more cause and effect in respect to Chinese behavior. That if China does X, there can and should at least be a consideration that the US responds Y. And transparency and clarity, strategic clarity, can play a role in pushing back more assertively with the Chinese, that if they do this, there's going to be more of a direct result as a consequence that could come through more clarity, more intention, more direction from the United States about its intention. I mentioned selling MH-60 Romeos. That's been a problematic platform. Perhaps it'll get sold now in the next several years. We'll wait and see. But if we're not prepared to sell helicopters to hunt submarines in the Taiwan Strait and around territorial waters, who's going to take care of that, right? The Chinese submarines are operating around the island. We should be clear about that, unless, of course, the Chinese commit not to operate submarines around the island. I think that's probably rather unrealistic. So anyway, not to witter on, but I think clarity and strategic clarity can play an important role in this latter point in respect to pushing back. And the time is now. It is now time for the United States and, frankly, the Japanese and the Australians as well, maybe others in Europe, if they're up for it, to inject more clarity into their positions as well, and less ambiguity. If you'd like to chat a wee bit more about it, just grab me. Yeah.
Patrick, can I ask you to weigh in on this? Over the last decade or so, there have been a number of times when members, congressional members, have tried to take steps to move us towards a position of strategic clarity. What does that debate look like on Capitol Hill right now? And what role does Congress have, you know, vice the president, in moving from ambiguity to clarity, if that's what Congress wants to do?
Mm-hmm. To be quite honest, I haven't heard much of the debate the last couple of years. You know, I think Russia-Ukraine has taken up a lot of the discussion at this juncture, and ongoing conflicts, you know, within the last year. So I think that has you know, taken a little bit of a backseat to some of the other foreign policy issues. I think it is a good debate. I think it is important for Congress to be involved in that. But at the end of the day, it's going to be largely driven by the administration and whoever's in charge, and how it's laid out via the national security strategy and national defense strategy. I think it's important. So I think it is important to have that discussion and debate. But ultimately, it's going to lie in the administration, whoever's in charge at the time.
Go ahead.
Time. I mean, Mr. Biden gave us clarity 4 times, right? He said we would come to Taiwan's defense. Bless him for it. Absolutely. In fairness to Mr. Trump moves us back towards more of a traditional interpretation of a strategic ambiguity. But he also made some comment. It was a little convoluted, but a comment about how, you know, he's had a chat with Mr. Xi, and Mr. Xi won't attack Taiwan while he's president. In a way, it was kind of Mr. Trump's version of clarity, that what he was suggesting was he wouldn't dare. You know, maybe there's some truth to that. Maybe we have to have another session to discuss that. But we are moving towards more clarity, bit by bit by bit. For those of you who fly to Taiwan regularly, if you fly the San Francisco to Taipei flight on United, that's not a pitch for United, although I do fly them. Even if you go back 3 or 4 years, there was self-evidently military personnel on it, but they didn't have their rucksacks with their names on the back, you know, in camo or in brown. It was a bit more discreet. Now, if you fly, they don't. It's the military rucksacks going in. If you go to a Taiwan hotel, there are self-evidently U.S. military personnel everywhere. I think that's a good thing. I think that kind of clarity is very useful, because it transmits with complete clarity American seriousness about our national interest as it relates to Taiwan. And I hope there's room for more of it, and it should come incrementally, right? Not in big steps, but incrementally.
Right. Well, we have come to the end of our time. big thank you to Patrick and Rupert for joining us. A really big thank you to Dr. Xu, who's joining us at 2:30 in the morning, Tuesday, Taiwan time. So we really appreciate you joining us, Dr. Xu. Please join me in thanking our panelists. And please stay put. We're going to go right into our next panel here.
Hello, my name is Jennifer Hong. I am one of the senior directors at the Institute for Indo-Pacific Security. Thank you so much for being here, for you joining here in person, as well as those of you who are joining online. We are now entering into our last portion of our event, where I feel like Rupert set it up really well. He talked about strategic clarity and talking about our allies, and time is now. And so don't worry, I won't make you make a stand for the countries that I've asked you to talk about today, and make a stance for those countries. But I think that it's not lost on us that this is also the country of Squad, right? Japan, Australia, the Philippines. And so we are going to spend some time today talking about allied perspective. I think it's so easy for us to think about Taiwan from the Washington, D.C., inside the Beltway perspective, but I think we often don't hear from our allies who look at Taiwan very similarly and also maybe slightly differently. So I'm so excited to have this group of experts here. Why don't I just go down and introduce our speakers? And then the order is I am actually going against all my moderating rules, where I'm actually going to ask each speaker to give a short remarks up front, just because we're talking about such broad topic. I've asked our speakers to talk about Australia, Japan, and the Philippines perspective. So we'll give them a few minutes to share some thoughts up front. I have some questions to ask them, and then I want you to ask questions to these experts here. For those of you joining us online, you know the rules. Name and affiliation, type your questions, and then we will try to entertain as many questions as possible. And in between, if you feel like there's an opportunity for you to interject and share some thoughts what other panelists are saying, please, I welcome you to just let me know, and we'll make sure the microphone goes your way. All right, so starting with you, Dr. Gregory Brown is the Executive Director of the Alliance Futures Initiative, Senior Fellow at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and the Adjunct Professor at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Now, his areas of interest include Indo-Pacific geopolitics, political demography, and emerging transnational security issues. You have many teaching and research appointments at universities in Australia and the United States, which include a PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. And then we have Iku Suhijiro, who is a research associate at the Hudson Institute's Japan chair. With Hudson Institute's Japan chair, your research topics include United States extended deterrence in Northeast Asia, Taiwan contingency readiness, and Indo-Pacific economic security. She has her MA in security studies at Georgetown University and BA from Brandeis. And then last but not least, we have Jeffe Kuitson, who is an associate fellow with the Southeast Asia program at CSIS. Research interests includes disinformation as it affects international democratic institutions, the intersection of trade and digital privacy, and the evolving role of the Philippines in the Indo-Pacific security. He has a bachelor degree from the Connecticut College. So with that, Greg, may I call you Greg, or should I call you Dr. Brown? Okay. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Let's start with Australia. 2024, there was a national defense strategy which shifted Australia towards strategy of denial, and then there was emphasis on the collective security in the Indo-Pacific. I think when we think about Taiwan, from Australia's perspective, I think it was mostly in the way a debate of whether it will get involved in the Taiwan contingency, and maybe saw ANZUS as a mechanism to bring Australia into a regional conflict that might not be interested in getting involved in. But recently there was an Australian New Zealand Defense Ministerial, ANZMIN, and they reaffirmed, and quote, the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, opposing any unilateral action to change the status quo, and then skip a little to continue deepening relations with Taiwan in the economic, trade, and cultural fields. Australia is presumably the largest energy exporter to Taiwan, and I think there are a lot of different cooperation still explored. So with that, please share thoughts on Australia and its Taiwan's significance.
Yep, hopefully this works. Everybody can hear me? Good. Jennifer, thank you for having us here today and for inviting me to speak a little bit about Australia. First, a caveat, little throat clearing. You hear my accent, I'm not Australian. I could say I play well on TV, but I don't even look good on TV, so it's usually radio. No, I do have a lot of contact with Australia. I talk to them just about every night of the week. I have this affiliation with the think tank in Canberra, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Worked for them here at DC for 3 years, and still very involved. Of course, have family in South Australia and in Queensland. So I care about the place, but I'm really not one of them. So I'm really a true observer. And with that, when I think of this big question about where Australia is with regard to Taiwan, I wish I could provide some more of that clarity that some people might be looking for with the Australians. Probably heard from this statement, from meeting with the New Zealanders, some nice words, maybe some platitudes, not a lot of clarity. What does this mean in terms of a change for Australia? I'd say not much. The Australian national conversation about Taiwan is functionally broken. It's broken because the discussion rarely moves past a single question, and that is, would Australia, would Canberra follow the United States into a war with China? And stops there, right? All hell breaks loose, the question gets asked, everybody has an opinion on the Americans and where they are today, and the discussion really doesn't go much further than that oftentimes. I think that has 3 problems with it in terms of the construction of what Australia might be trying to do, or what it could do. First, it sort of erases the Taiwanese people as part of the discussion. It also, I think, treats potential Chinese active force as though it were a neutral event. This is really about our relationship with the Americans, not about with Beijing. And 3, it ignores the catastrophic economic and social consequences for Australia if something were to occur with regard to Taiwan. And that would be consequences that would happen regardless of if a single Australian soldier deploys. So yes, what does Australia actually have to lose? A lot. And so let me go through at least 4 vulnerabilities. One, as we already mentioned here, Australia has about 28% of its exports pass through the Taiwan Strait. About 85% of its iron ore exports that leave Port Hedland in the northwest of Australia pass through the strait on its way to northern China. And of course, any disruption of that flow would not require a war. It just requires a quarantine or a blockade. The flow stops and Australia suffers. Like the rest of the world, the world's dependence on Taiwanese semiconductors is vital for Australia. I think something like 80 or 90% of the most sophisticated chips are made there. If that supply is disrupted for Australia, medical devices don't get replaced. The economy starts to falter, which leads to the big risk for Australia, recession risk. Any serious Chinese economic downturn, so in the PRC, any economic downturn triggered by a conflict or other cause would almost certainly push Australia into recession. So I'm not here talking about the knock-on effects of there being a conflict, but really the level of integration between those 2 economies. And the 4th vulnerability for Australia, I think, is something social. And that is social disruption that might take place inside Australia if there is a problem in Taiwan. There are about 50,000 Taiwanese people of Taiwanese descent living in Australia, another 25,000 students studying in Australia. If something were to occur in Taiwan, this would affect all of them. There are also approximately 1.1, 1.2, maybe 1.3 million Australians of Chinese descent, which raises some interesting questions about what would occur. My understanding is the PRC does have some control and influence among a lot of the Chinese language in Australia. No doubt if something were to occur in Taiwan, this would be disruptive to those larger communities. And then there might be a spillover to the larger Australian community as well. An example of how this might take place and what the Australians might feel about it would be just a couple years ago when the foreign minister from Beijing was visiting, referred to 1.2 million Chinese in Australia. And the Penny Wong, the Australian foreign minister, had to remind him that we call those people Australians, not Chinese. And therefore, we understand that there might be some tension there. And I'll leave my initial comments at that.
All right, let me go down to Iku. We are now coming off of a fresh Trump Takaichi visit, where they committed to peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. And with that, I know it's not lost on many of us that there is a medium surface, I'm going to get this right, medium range surface to air missiles deployed to Yonaguni, which is the closest landmass to Taiwan. So Japan has had lots of movement when it comes to Taiwan. So turn it over to you.
Well, first of all, thank you, Jennifer, for having me here. And yes, I think Japan has gone through a lot in the last few years. And with the Prime Minister visiting President Trump, I think there's been a lot of interesting developments. And I think I have a lot to talk about Iran, but I'm sure that may be coming up a little later. So I would like to first focus on how Japan perceives Taiwan. And I'd like to say that how Japan perceives Taiwan is complicated because it's layered. And what I mean by layered is how the government and folks who are thinking about national security always is very different, obviously, from the usual people of Japan. So, of course, in everybody's mind, I think China's threat is rising. So even the normal, right, daily living folks of Japan are also recognizing that. So I think how people perceive China is definitely changing. And I'd like to say I think that's more fresh in everyone's mind rather than maybe just focusing on Taiwan. And I want to start off with talking about the lower house election that we just had back in February. Obviously, Takaichi administration was able to kind of move on with the major win. And national security was actually one of the most important interested topic for Japanese people. Number 1 to 3 was all tax finance, all obviously related to how finance is in people's normal life. But actually, number 4 was national security. So it's actually interesting. I think people are starting to think about national security as a more of a daily challenger topic in Japan too. But with that being said, of course, still tax, inflation, financial policy are still the major considerations for Japanese people. But then actually also I think Ukraine war has started to shift people's view little by little. Prime Minister Abe had a famous kind of debate that he brought up about nuclear sharing, that maybe it's time for Japan to also reconsider about U.S. extended deterrence. And, you know, I'm sure, I mean, it's not, you know, Japanese people are not asking for nuclear weapons, but it's significant enough that Japanese people were able to kind of start thinking about extended deterrence and nuclear sharing, or what it means to have a nuclear umbrella over Japan. And even though, and that is the case, people still have anti-war sentiments, right? This doesn't mean that Japanese people are now ready to go to war. So essentially, I think it comes down to this important question. What is important is whether Japan and the Japanese people are asking the right question on national security. Right? Japan has gone a great length to thinking about our own national security in recent years. And that's an achievement of many folks that has been trying to move this into the right direction. We've had Tomahawk procurements, establishment of JJOC, and now the Takaichi administration has 17 different fields of economic growth. And that is now tied to defense and national security. And I think that's a very major achievement for us, that now we're able to think about economic growth tied to defense. But the real question is, what should we do to achieve national security for Japan, first of all, right? Regardless of any political or other factors? How much are people willing to sacrifice, and for what exactly? What does it mean to defend our own nation? And at this point, we must consider these plans regardless of US politics. But then this also means the Japanese government also has obligations to explain to the people of Japan what it means to protect our nation, right? What does it mean to consider about Taiwan? And most importantly, at the end, I think it's our job to constantly communicate with the US and continue to tell the US government that Taiwan is a shared interest. It's a shared challenge that we must face together. And hopefully in the next few years and in moving forward in the next many years that we are able to do this. Thank you.
Okay, Japheth, we are now looking into the Philippines. I know Philippines is very busy with everything that's happening in South China Sea, but I want to direct our attention to the 12th Philippine-U.S. bilateral strategic dialogue that just happened in February 2026. And in that conversation, there was a lot of emphasis on collective defense and deterring aggression in the first island chain. Committed to maintaining high vigilance in the Indo-Pacific to prevent conflict, and commitment to establish robust deterrent capabilities. So Philippines, what's the perspective from the Philippines about Taiwan and its strategic importance?
Great. Thank you again so much for having me. It was wonderful hearing from my co-panelists as well about a situation that's always really near and dear to my heart in terms of what I'm researching. The Philippines, in terms of what perspectives we're looking at. We are right at the front door. The Philippines' northern tip of Luzon is only 200 miles away from the southernmost tip of Taiwan. There's an island chain right in the middle of the channel called the Batanes, which are right in the halfway point where many Filipinos live, and the Philippine Coast Guard, Philippine Armed Forces have been expanding upon its presence in the last couple of years. There's a lot at stake, right? There's 200,000 Taiwanese, Filipinos living in Taiwan, right? And in any sort of scenario, as the Philippines is currently learning right now with its OFW, or Overseas Filipino Worker Evacuations in the Middle East, any sort of non-combatant evacuation operations are incredibly difficult logistically. To this end, you have an administration in the Philippines that is actually talking about Taiwan for the first time. This isn't a typical facet of Filipino foreign policy. Under President Bongbong Marcos, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the Philippines has taken a lot more of an active voice in talking about Taiwan issues. In August last year, I think President Marcos said something along the lines of the Philippines will be dragged kicking and screaming into a Taiwan contingency if that is to occur. For the first time, you hear senior Philippine secretaries, from Secretary Tess Lazaro at Foreign Affairs or Secretary Gibot Teodoro at Department of National Defense, actually talking about the necessity of Taiwan contingency planning, right? This is very groundbreaking for the Philippines as it's starting to look outwards. Previously, the armed forces of the Philippines have looked inward toward domestic threats in rural parts of the country with Islamic insurgents or communist insurgents, but for the first time in the last 2 years, it's looking outward in its comprehensive archipelagic defense concept. And that requires a significant amount of modernization that is all a bit delayed. Under the Duterte administration, right before Marcos, a couple of these upgrades weren't necessarily followed up on, which meant that the Marcos administration, bless you, really had to pick up the pace in procuring new equipment, whether that's new missiles from India, whether that's new jet fighters from the Republic of Korea, or whether that's new sonar systems coming from Japan and the United States. Cooperation and defense cooperation from the Philippines partners is of paramount importance, because Taiwan isn't necessarily top of mind, but it is directly adjacent to an issue that you mentioned at the top of this, the South China Sea. Every day, Filipinos are very conscious of, Marines on derelict boats. The BRP Sierra Madre is stuck on a reef with very limited supplies and difficult resupply missions, right? This is front of mind, the defense of the Philippines territory in the South China Sea from Chinese aggression. If you poll the Philippine public, I think recent polling has showed Filipinos feel quite neutral toward Taiwan. Yes, it's an important issue. Yes, it's very adjacent to the country. Yes, we have Filipino citizens there. But at the end of the day, they would rather not get dragged into a war that would be right on their doorstep. Again, the region is already coming to understand what evacuations from abroad look like and what clogged trade would look like. The Philippines is already experiencing record high gas prices, oil prices, due to the current conflict in Iran. These issues would intensify several-fold with a contingency situation right on the Philippines' doorstep. Right. Certainly, there's a lot of encouraging signs in the U.S.-Philippine relationship. We just had we have bigger and bigger balikatan, or shoulder-to-shoulder exercises every year, with this year having the inclusion of actually 1,000 Japanese self-defense force members, which is a big development for what was once a far smaller and far more intimate cooperation exercise. The islands I mentioned that are right between Taiwan and the Philippines and the Batanes just had their first marine cooperation activities with the United States earlier this month, right? There's a lot of momentum there, but only with the United States and the Philippines. There's still a lot of work that needs to happen in terms of connective tissue with the other allies in the region, whether that's Australia, whether that's Japan. These partnerships aren't quite as solid as the United States is yet. And a glaring omission from so many of these conversations regarding Taiwan are Taiwanese themselves, right? There was a presidential directive that was lifted last year that actually allowed for engagement from Philippine government officials, saving, of course, except for the president, the vice president, the secretary of national defense, and foreign affairs from actually participating in dialogues. More Track 1.5 dialogues, more connective tissues between the Philippines, its partners, and Taiwan could go a long way in creating some strategic clarity for a very difficult situation that can very clearly spill over so many different areas in the region, for the Philippines, for Australia, for Japan, you name it. I could go on about this all day, but I'll stop here for the sake of our panel.
You. I do want to, I will ask you some questions. I do want to encourage our audience members to ask questions. I see someone just walked in. Hi, Trey. And our audience members to also think of your questions. I see questions are starting to come in. So I think there are 3 words that I picked up from 3 of you: broken, layered, high stakes, when it comes to Taiwan. I mean, I know that doesn't sum up everything, but those are the words that stood out to me. I know that so much of what Taiwan means for the region is also very much influenced by your domestic politics, domestic perception of the people. And I know some of you kind of touched upon public's perception. What you're talking about in terms of how Taiwan is viewed, would you be able to tell me how much of government, the public reaction, they're kind of in line or not in line? How close, how far are they? Who wants to start? You talked about the public perception, so why don't we start there and then we'll work our way back here.
Sure, happy to start there. So again, public perception in the Philippines on the Taiwan issue is something quite scary, something quite ominous, and very, very close. But this is secondary in terms of the Philippines' major security issues in the region, which are its own territorial interests in the South China Sea. I'm sure you're all no stranger to news reports of collisions, lasers, water cannons being fired at Philippine forces. It is a almost constant issue that's in the Philippine news cycle, in no small part thanks to transparency measures by the Philippine Coast Guard and other parts of the armed forces, right? This is only part of a bigger problem. Certainly Filipinos would feel some sort of I would imagine that Filipinos would feel some sort of affinity for their democratic neighbor, but at this point, the Philippines Department of Foreign Affairs still does not recognize Taiwan, though it has spoken about it frequently in government briefings. I think Iko had mentioned this previously, but in terms of what the government is willing to do and say might not necessarily be connected with what everyday Filipinos on the ground are talking about. It's not a big part of the national conversation for the general public as it might be for Philippine government officials.
Yeah, I think we talked maybe a lot about that, but if I had to add anything to it, I think Japan is in an interesting position. Geographically, we are facing Russia, North Korea, and China. And so daily we get all these like North Korean missile alerts, and we're seeing Senkaku Islands issues, and obviously Russia just there for, years that we've been having issues. So we are an island that is quite facing a lot of problems. And so again, I like to reiterate that we are friendly towards Taiwan, and I think a lot of people like Taiwan, right? But our kind of vision is more focused on, okay, China's scary. We are fearful what may happen. And then there is a very majority kind of support for the current government. That's great. The key is for the Takaichi administration or any other administration to continue to have high supporting rate. And that requires careful explanations to the Japanese domestic audience, because if the government keeps changing every year, like it's been like in the past years, we're not going to be able to establish anything in a timely manner. I'd like to say that. Yeah.
I'm going to borrow one of the other words. For Australia, public opinion is layered. Maybe start with the elite opinion at the government level and across all political parties, all major political parties in any case. Since 1972, Australian elites, since they adopted a one China policy, have agreed to that. And that's what you tend to hear from everybody in Parliament who speaks about it. To the extent we have some fringe parties and individuals and personalities in the Australian Parliament, most of them probably haven't really thought much about Taiwan. That's not why they're fringe. It's not about foreign policy, particularly not this issue in particular. At another level, we have a series of elites who break into probably two camps. And for this, I'll refer to an October 2025 study by my colleagues at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, looking at elites across the country, finding that those two camps break down to those who think a Taiwan contingency might result in limited effects on Australia, something that's temporary, something that be overcome, and another smaller camp that sees this as perhaps an existential threat to Australia. Not that Australia can't exist, but that its understanding of its prosperity and its security and well-being is at stake, and therefore something needs to be done right now. One of those two camps is louder and probably has more influence in Parliament, and that's the group that actually tends to downplay a Taiwan contingency. If we get all the way out to the public, like everywhere else, this country and throughout the West, most publics receive their opinions by the media that they consume. And in Australia, that media, like here and across the West, tends to be shallow, personality-driven, and inconsistent, which is exactly what the opinions of the Australian public are with regard to Taiwan. Incredibly shallow, incredibly inconsistent, and mainly driven by personalities. What did my leader tell me to say? What does the person I trusted on some other issue tell me to say? How do I feel about the American president today? That's how I feel about foreign policy. So again, Australian public opinion is variable and can vary based upon those kinds of factors. If we look at the other group in the middle, I think that's where there could be a change, and we should expect something to happen. Among other elites, people who are watching, people who have investments in the international economy. Again, the majority of the population in that group, those people who are looking at this, who know something about it, would tend to think there are at least limited effects, maybe some catastrophic effects. What can we do about that? But they oftentimes then play down even mentioning Taiwan because of that integration between mainland China and the Australian economies. Any mention of Taiwan sometimes will get you into trouble with the people who pay your bills. So that means that if an Australian politician mentions Taiwan and perhaps the need to support or defend Taiwan, you could receive phone calls as soon as you get back to your office from the CEOs of certain natural resource extraction companies saying, why are you putting all of our contracts at risk today? And by the way, that means jobs and that means votes. You should be more silent. So what we end up facing in Australia is a lot of people who are probably aware of the situation, but because of their interests, they will be strategically naive, or at least appear so, in how they present themselves to the Australian public. So again, we are left with less clarity than we would otherwise have.
This is rather a very sober assessment coming from all of you. As a think tank that's been focused on Taiwan's strategic importance to the United States for the last 20 years, we were maybe one of the few voices in Washington, D.C., really fighting for our leaders and policymakers to hear why Taiwan is important. So we are fully ready to embrace the battle ahead for all your not all your capitals, but the capitals in Australia, Japan, and the Philippines. And it is a good reminder for all of us to know what we hear inside the Beltway and what we're always talking about Taiwan. To be fair, though, I think even when I joined this institute about 5 years ago, I think the conversation around Taiwan was still pretty limited. And so once again, we're ready for that fight to continue in the good names. But I guess I want to know, what should Taiwan do differently to become not more relevant or not more strategically important, because Taiwan as a nation is important and it is strategic. But is there anything that you think that you can think of in the respective capitals that would help Taiwan become not a taboo issue, not a broken or a layered or just a high stake, but limited conversation? Very hard question. I'm asking you to solve a problem here. Go ahead. Who wants to go? You picked up the mic, so I just turned to you, but yeah.
I'll keep it pretty short. Really, really good question. I wish I knew the answer. I'm not sure it's an answer, though, for Taiwan, the answer. As I mentioned, Australia has national interests in Taiwan being secure, in Taiwan being prosperous, in Taiwan retaining its autonomy. And Australia's interests are deep. These aren't really about that big question there's asking, oh, are we going to follow the United States into war? No, this is about Australian interests. And that is about Australians being able to identify and articulate what its strategy is for the region. And they're not great. I mean, nobody's great at strategy, and nobody's really good at grand strategy. But the Australians don't even attempt grand strategy. Describe the world and the region the way that Australia would like to have it. Well, we'll wait for someone else to tell us. Maybe that's changing, and maybe we'll see more shifts. I'll be honest, when AUKUS was announced in 2021, I was in shock. One, that they had invited me to comment on it before they did it, but two, that this was odd for the Australians, who were so used to deferring to the United States, and whatever the U.S. gave us, we'll accept, and we'll go along with it. And here, for the first time, were the Australians stepping up and saying, we want to be a major player on our own. We're willing to ask for the American crown jewels of the U.S. Navy, nuclear propulsion. And we'll go to our friends in the UK and see if they can help us get that. But that was very out of character, a cultural paradigm shift for the Australians. If the Australians can have that confidence about their own region, maybe they'll understand why Taiwan is important. Yes, for chips. Yes, because there's a cultural connection, right? Liberal democracies and all the Taiwanese in Australia and that ongoing history between the two countries. But also for the strategic importance of the first island chain and what that means for Australia's own ability to export its goods and import goods such that it can exist in a prosperous world and a prosperous Australia. Australia cannot live if any of those choke points are closed. Be honest, it's a country that exports wheat and imports crackers. It desperately needs to have that connection with the region. It desperately needs it to be peaceful. It's up to the Australians to step forward and make their own world happen. Otherwise, it will happen to them.
So I think the biggest confusion we have that we often hear in DC is, how much is Taiwan actually committed to its own defense, right? And I think we hear different things because we hear from different experts. And I don't doubt that Taiwan cares about its own national security. But the question is, okay, well, what if the US and Japan are there? And Taiwan's like, well, actually, it's gotten complicated. Or that it doesn't even get there, that it just kind of breaks from internally. So I think that's the question that we want to know more about. How much is Taiwan committed? And if so, how committed can we get there together?
So that's a really difficult question, right? Thinking about what Taiwan could do better to actually improve its standing within the region and figure out what a regional response could look like. Speaking only from the Philippines case, I understand that through different roundtables, different meetings, that there is a strong appetite from Philippine think tankers, policymakers, people in government to speak with their Taiwanese counterparts, actually have a discussion on difficult issues that will affect both countries quite significantly. Remember that 200-mile gap, right? And so actually having these conversations, continuing to engage in dialogue, I think could be one of the most important things Taiwan could do. It is very difficult for allies and partners to come to your aid and understand how they can help you if these needs are not being communicated, right? Sometimes I hear about a sort of hesitancy from Taiwanese bodies to actually engage on the topic, which of course I can understand is a deeply sensitive issue, a deeply difficult issue to navigate. But again, allies in the region can only do so much as, they can only do so much with little information. That's what I would say in this regard.
Okay, I'm expecting some good questions from all of you because I will ask my last question. Iran, the big elephant in the room, as you're representing countries today, are looking at the Iran, what's the relevance to the Taiwan contingency? How are each capitals looking at, governments looking at how the Iran contingency is with Taiwan contingency? I'm going to start with you. Yeah.
So I'm excited about this question because I don't want to speak for everyone, but this is the problem. The Middle East is what Asians or us, I think I would say Japanese, care about a lot. When we have a lot of meetings, when Japanese people come to DC, I think the first thing they want to ask, and it's not just recently, it's been years, they want to ask, okay, how important is the Middle East to the US? Is it most important to the US, right? Does the US care only about the Middle East? And yeah, this is a sensitive topic to Japan. And so I think there are a few things that Japan can learn from the Iran conflict that just arose, right? So of course, there's the energy element. Actually, Taiwan probably faces a bigger issue than Japan does right now because of its reliance on LNG. But then it has coal as an alternative. Japan just released emergency barrels of oil, but it's going to last about a little less than a year, so I'm not too worried about the short-term effects, even though the price is, of course, rising in Japan. But I think this is a good opportunity for both countries to say, okay, we need diversifications of energy, right? And then that means domestic energy sources too. And that is naturally nuclear energy. And yes, I know DPP really, really dislikes nuclear energy, but I think that the sentiment is starting to change in both countries. Japan just restarted one of its nuclear power plants. This is the time we turn to each other and say, okay, we need to really think strategically about nuclear energy. And second, of course, we are seeing tons of cheap drones from Iran, and then America's using like Patriot missiles to shoot them down, and that is not an effective way to fight cost-wise. So Japan needs to think of alternative kind of layered, and I keep using layered, but invest in layered defense equipment. So from drones to missiles, it's great that we bought Tomahawks, but we need to also invest in drones, right? And so one of the things that's great is that GCAP, Japan, Italy, and England are working on fighter jets, but they just announced that they are going to also consider UAVs for that. And that's great. I think just, different types of weapons we need to consider from costly to non-costly. and how fast businesses and civilians should evacuate, right? I think that's a great example that Japan cares about a lot, emergency evacuations of folks, right? And I'm going to touch on the very sensitive topic, right? 2,500 Marines were taken out of Okinawa. That is something big for Japan, right? And I think we always talk about like, okay, well, do Indo-PACOM stuff get sent to EUCOM? And, you know, we would always say, no, that's not really how it works. But I mean, this time Marines were taken out, I think along with USS Tripoli, and not every information is out, but there are rumors or evidence that the reporters maybe have found that maybe some things have also been taken out of Yokosuka, right? And 2,500 Marines isn't just 2,500. And then there's more additional folks that were also taken out, right? Because it's always backup forces are also required, right? So I think this is very important for Japan, right? We want to hear from the US that Japan matters. We want to hear from US that Indo-Pacific always matters. And it doesn't mean that we don't care about the Middle East, but this is a very sensitive topic to Japan.
All right, from the Philippines perspective then, the Iran war has been a cause of concern. If you look throughout Philippine social media, you'll see all sorts of, whether organic or bot posts, talking about the strikes on U.S. bases throughout the Middle East, videos of U.S. bases in flames, and wondering, are we next, right? The Philippines, I might not have mentioned earlier, has recently added additional enhanced defense cooperation access bases in the north of the country, 3 of them, all of which are closest to Taiwan and could very much be very useful in the event of non-combatant evacuation operations, as well as pre-positioning, as the U.S. is the Philippines' biggest ally, right? And so this has created a sort of strange sentiment on social media that could very well be exploited by, Chinese disinformation farms that are already trying to wreak havoc in the Philippine information space on the South China Sea, creating all sorts of distorted posts that say that the Philippines is the aggressor in many of the incidents in the South China Sea, creating a small vocal minority of Filipino people actively pushing for, more cooperation with China, saying that China is misunderstood, and, even in more stronger language, calling, the current government, the Marcos administration and Philippine policy as behavior befitting of a lapdog to the United States, right? Taking agency away from the country, right? These very same disinformation tactics, these very same bots that spread South China Sea disinformation could very well create the same kind of fire of Iran war disinformation, making Filipinos even more wary of the presence of these enhanced defense cooperation agreement sites in the country. In terms of the logistics, fuel, supplies, food, the Philippines is an archipelagic nation of around 7,000 islands, and it's deeply, deeply sensitive to external supply shocks. Already it's starting to feel the effects of higher oil prices, higher gas prices, with protests out on the street at the Marcos administration's handling of this. There were also protests at the outbreak of the war toward the beginning, right? Filipinos are seemingly quite war averse because of the significant economic and quality of life impacts on them personally, right? Oil prices, gas prices, getting around Metro Manila. Have any of you been to Metro Manila? You all know how much transportation is required, how often you'll be stuck in traffic. Cars are essential. Fuel is essential. Everyday food is essential to an island that is not quite energy sufficient or food sufficient, right? And so these are definitely factors that will come to mind when we think of the Taiwan situation. I think I mentioned earlier that the evacuation of overseas Filipino workers is a bit of a practice run. Yes, it's a faraway conflict. Yes, the Philippines is not directly involved. The home islands are not involved. But still, the mass logistics of bringing Filipinos from the Middle East is probably painting a picture to the government. How prepared are we for this? Are we actually ready to bring our civilians home from this? And more so than that, it's the closest possible evacuation center, not just for the Philippines, but for all the other ASEAN countries, all of whom have significant presences in Taiwan, not to mention Japanese nationals, Australian nationals, US nationals, you name it, they're all in Taiwan. The Philippines is the closest friendly port for these sorts of situations. And so I would say that, keeping a pulse check on public opinion is very important. There still is very strong support for Philippines' territorial issues themselves, but actually creating a broader narrative of understanding the Taiwan problem from the average Filipino could go a long way in countering harmful narratives online. And yes, I'll stop there.
In anticipation of this question, I created a list of 4 key takeaways for Australia, knowing that the list might change order or get longer, just like the U.S. Reasons for engaging Iran at this time. The first, as we've already heard, it's really the same thing you've seen in the Philippines and in Japan and Australia as well. Distant waters produce domestic economic shocks. And if that's the case in the Strait of Hormuz, imagine what it would be if it's a lot closer to home, a lot more vital to those Australian resources, if it's the strait that we've been talking about today. Again, the Middle East can lead to the spike in energy, then maybe food and everything else. For Australians, it is the north. It is all of those straits to the north that matter most. So they're definitely watching this and wondering what that could mean. And likewise, that multi-theater strain. Right? Things occurring on the other side of the world means it's the attention, and maybe the most vital resource for the United States and the Australians is going to be attention, right? You might have money and you might have military assets, but do you have the time today to deal with that? And the Australians are definitely watching that. And I think Americans are watching that too. So I refer everybody to Zach Cooper's piece in Foreign Affairs this last month. Zach has a particularly broad and full definition of what a pivot to Asia might have looked like. Perhaps it could have been different, but nobody's talking about a pivot today, right? So just like Al Pacino in Godfather 3 thought you were out of the Middle East, no, it pulls you right back in. The Australians are definitely watching this and wondering then what will the Chinese be doing while the rest of the world is looking elsewhere. I also think that the Australians are probably watching how Beijing plays this in terms of cognitive narratives. What are the stories that that Beijing tells about what's happening in Iran? We didn't see Beijing come out right in full-throated defense of Venezuela, not doing so much with Iran, basically hedging, playing a role, but also having a narrative about, well, who's the real aggressor here? And which model is leading to destabilization around the world, including in the Indo-Pacific? Is it really the Chinese economic model that you need to be wary of? Or is it the Americans trying to break up your system? And definitely, I think the Australians are watching that, and it probably is having some effect among some parts of the Australian public. And the last thing I think that a lesson from this is just looking at how the rest of the world has responded to what Israel and the United States and Iran are up to, is that coordinated deterrence must be prepositioned, and if it's improvised, it will be inadequate. So the Europeans rushing to get something done. You're in, you're out. The Pacific partners, you're in, you're out. And we're still going through this now. I'm not sure how it will be in another 2 weeks, depending upon where we are. It would be really nice, I think, for the Australians to have some consistency and to know that if great powers do something, our regional allies, the other middle powers and regional allies, have some consistency, and we can look to each other, and we should build that out.
Okay, with all of that, I left very few minutes for questions. So despite all my encouragements, I apologize. What I'm going to do is I have some questions online as well. So just show of hands, who has questions? I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so let me just collect 2 from the front row, and then we'll start here.
Thank you. Hi, thank you for your insightful discussion. My name is Tian from Taiwan Navy, now as a visiting fellow in the RAND Corporation. And my question is about considering, the background is every time when we play the word gaming or the tabletop exercise, and when we play the Korean, Japan, or other countries near to Taiwan, we know, there's not that much interest to participate in the conflict. But considering that the lack of communication channel between Taipei and Beijing. Do you think is there any possibility to be the bridge, the negotiator or communicator in such a scenario? I mean, yeah, to improve or to lower the risk that the conflict happened. I think maybe that's a thing we can do, but not rather than to send in force to Taiwan Strait. Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to collect one more in the front, and then thank you. Name, affiliation, and then a quick question. Thank you.
Hi, Gerrit van der Wees again, George Mason University. Most countries, including the three that you represent here, have a one China policy, and that's usually kind of used to keep Taiwan at a distance. But that one China policy was devised in the 1970s under very different situation where the Kuomintang still claiming we are the government of all of China. Taiwan is a democracy now. To what extent does the fact that Taiwan is a democracy play a role in attitudes in your country, in the policies of your countries?
Happy to discuss perceptions from the Philippines on Taiwan being a neighboring democracy. I think when President Lai was elected, I think one of the first tweets that came out was from President Marcos himself. Congratulations, President Lai, on your election to the presidency. And there was a very quick statement from the Philippine Department of Foreign Affairs reiterating, of course, that the Philippines does follow the one China policy. Right? I don't imagine any movement in that recognition in the very near future, right? Like certainly I believe that the Marcos administration and the Philippines have it in their best interests to continue dialogue without, without necessarily full recognition. It's already made significant steps with that presidential decree that I had discussed earlier, allowing more Filipinos to actually go to Taiwan for these dialogues. Again, these sorts of communications I think will be absolutely crucial. And defense of democracies, of course, requires good networking, good communication skills, and consistency, right? Whether it's between the three partners you see here today, or whether that's between them and Taiwan, right?
I'll answer the first question. I think that we may want to be mediators, but whether China would accept us, the mediators, is a different story because we are all U.S. allies and partners, and we may, in their mind, strongly align with the U.S. side. I don't know how much of a neutral participant we could be.
Both questions. On that first question, Australia's in the same place. What does Beijing think? I'm not going to take direction from Canberra, and they don't have the power to do anything or remove the needle anyway. So that's probably not an option for Canberra, although the Australians definitely would probably like to play that role or are desperate to play a role like that. On the one China policy and its utility today, considering that Taiwan is a different place. It does mean, and that is a message that does resonate among the Australian public. If they know anything about Taiwan, they don't understand how its parliament works. They don't understand its political history, but they do get told that it is a liberal democracy today, and that does have an effect on the public. It probably has less effect, though, on the elites who are looking more at, well, what is our national interest here? And we don't go race around the rest of the world trying to defend every liberal democracy. We need to be very cagey about how we approach this one. But I think that is maybe one of the lessons, and maybe that's something for Taiwan to think about, what to press. If you're trying to move the public, make them feel something.
I think there were 3 more questions, so we'll go in second row, 1, 2, and then, so we'll start with Kyle.
Hi, hello. I'm Kyle from IIPS, and my question is more directed towards you, Jafet, about Southeast Asia. As someone who analyzes the multilateral negotiations within the region, I'd love to know more about how Taiwan's more soft power strategies, such as the new southbound policy, have been effective in the Philippines. From my knowledge, a lot of it is about energy and cooperation within the region. So I'd love to know more about it.
So my question is on the countries that actually recognize Taiwan. So if you look at Vatican, Guatemala, Haiti, Kiribati, and we have like a bunch of other small countries that recognize Taiwan. So what is the strategy on them as well, and how are they working with the Quad or even the Squad? How are they also working with them on, because they've already committed to the, you know, recognition? So what's anything you can add on that?
Hi, I'm Allison. I'm from the George Washington University and the U.S.-China Education Trust. So my question is directed for Iku. I found your point about extended nuclear deterrence really interesting, especially since it's so consequential in a possible standoff or face-off between the U.S. and China. But regarding Japan's stance on nuclear deterrence or the possibility of maybe I know it's unlikely still for Japan to have its own native nuclear program, but I wanted to see if you can expand upon what you might think is going to happen going forward with the nuclear deterrence treaties or agreements in the area, especially Japan's future stance. Thank you.
A time, so I'm going to give every speaker who wants to speak a minute and a half.
Thank you for your question. Well, so Japan has formed a different council of experts to talk about different defense and economic related issues recently. And as you all may know, nuclear submarine has also come up with one of the topic, and that's a sensitive topic. I think that recent polls have indicated that at least, and then of course polls are sometimes reliable and not reliable, but they have indicated that 70% of Japanese are at least interested in having debates about nuclear sharing. And this is not to say that they agree or they're positive about that. It is to indicate that they are actually worried about nuclear deterrence or maybe certain commitments to the Indo-Pacific deterrence. With the rise of questions and potential weapons like nuclear submarines, and even though they're mainly people are focused on VLS, I think the conversation of deterrence is moving forward. Japan is interested in doing more in the region, and Japan is also interested in reconfirming that a nuclear deterrence and extended deterrence. While I think my point is that considering nuclear deterrence is a different options from whether we can actually host U.S. nuclear weapons in Japan. We just don't have infrastructure capabilities and delivery systems to be able to do that. So regarding Taiwan contingency, it may be difficult, but in thinking of long-term plans, I think this is a good debate to have in Japan.
Great question on the countries that recognize Taiwan. So in the region here that we're talking about three. So it's Palau, Republic of Marshall Islands, and Tuvalu. This is the front line, right? This is where the diplomatic warfare is occurring right now. All of them have dependencies on the PRC to some extent. All of them have this longer relationship with Taiwan and recognize that. Also some appreciation for what Taiwan is today, a liberal democracy like they would like to be. And investing appropriately in those places. But that is definitely the front line. And my fear, of course, is that we're always just one election away from each one of those locations flipping to recognizing Beijing and not Taipei, which means people who are interested in that probably ought to double down. Of course, that's exactly what we saw at a place like Nauru. The day after the election in Taiwan, the PRC was all ready to go. They'd already lined it all up. If it goes that direction, the place flips literally 24 hours later. And that's, of course, what interested parties in Palau and RMI and Tuvalu would want to avoid.
Thank you so much for the question on the state of regional perceptions of Taiwan's soft power. Unfortunately, I have a very blunt answer for you. Though there are, Southeast Asia is not a monolith, and there are 11 different countries with 11 different interests, right? But what unites so many of them is their economic dependency on China. You'll find that many ASEAN countries are unwilling to take a hard line on difficult issues, because they are all very deeply sensitive to external supply shocks. Any sinking in trade with China, or inflows of products, or exports of products, you name it, could be very, very disadvantageous for local governments trying to seek re-election and contain stability, continue stability throughout their terms. So while I would imagine there's still a significant amount of public support for Taiwan throughout Southeast Asia, unfortunately, I think you'd find that from all 11 countries, the government line will be fairly similar. While this is appreciated, we must not get into this too much as to avoid angering China, right? These economic lifelines are crucial for all of them, right? It's far too sensitive. I can talk about this a lot more offline, but there's a lot going on there.
Thank you so much. I know we did not get to all the questions in the room as well as those who've submitted questions online. We apologize, but this is just a reminder for us that I think a conversation like this has to be had more in Washington, D.C. so that we know there's still a lot more work to do for us. Thank you all for joining us today. We are pretty active on our social media and on our website, so please follow us for our next event. We have a few more reports and events coming out, so hopefully you'll join us for that. So thank you, everyone.